Before she became the smiling grandmother of the nation, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was a bride, and her wedding treasures helped build the myth that lasted for the rest of her life. Thursday, April 26, 1923, Westminster Abbey, London. The morning was cold and blustery, with intermittent rain showers pushing through the city from the west. 19 cameramen from the Topical Film Company had been positioned throughout the Abbey from numerous angles, on balconies, at the transept, along the nave, and had been there since before dawn. 3 days earlier, members of the press had been invited to a preview of the wedding gown. Newspapers had already printed a sketch of it that morning. The Illustrated London News was preparing to call the whole thing a white triumph. The newly formed British Broadcasting Company had wanted to record and broadcast the ceremony on radio. The request was vetoed by the chapter of Westminster, though the Dean was in favor. So instead, the cameras filmed, the sketches ran in print, and somewhere between 40 and 50,000 people lined the streets between Buckingham Palace and Westminster Abbey to see the carriages pass. They cheered. A correspondent for The Times recorded the sound of it. Inside the Abbey, something happened that nobody had formally planned, and that no subsequent royal bride has forgotten. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, daughter of the 14th Earl of Strathmore, walked toward the altar and paused at the tomb of the unknown warrior. She set her bouquet of white roses and heather down on the stone. Her brother, Fergus Bowes-Lyon, had been killed at the Battle of Loos in 1915. The gesture was described at the time as unexpected and unprecedented. Every royal bride since has placed flowers at that tomb, but after the ceremony, not before, and it's Elizabeth's spontaneous act in 1923 that established the tradition. That detail matters because it shows what Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon understood at 22 years old. That the day wasn't merely personal, it was symbolic. It was documented. It was watched. Westminster Abbey hadn't hosted a royal wedding in 541 years, not since Richard II married Anne of Bohemia in 1382. The choice of venue was itself a statement, and Elizabeth walked into that statement dressed in deep ivory chiffon moiré, embroidered with pearls and silver thread. The dress had been designed by Madame Handley Seymour, the same dressmaker who dressed Queen Mary. The veil was a loan from Queen Mary. A strip of Brussels lace woven into the gown was a Strathmore family heirloom. The dress had 2 trains, one fastened at the hips, one floating from the shoulders. The dressmakers had still been at work the day before. Elizabeth had divided that Tuesday between the wedding rehearsal at the Abbey and her own fitting. The dress was worked on until the last possible hour. At the ceremony, she chose not to wear a tiara. A chaplet of leaves secured the veil instead, which, given the quantity of tiaras she was about to acquire, reads in retrospect as the last time she would appear at a major public occasion without that particular category of object. She wore on her body that morning a double strand of pearls with a small pearl pendant, diamond earrings, and the Cullinan 3 and 4 brooch loaned from the royal collection. She wore an ermine cape, a gift from King George V, over her dress in the carriage to the Abbey and on the balcony of Buckingham Palace afterward. What she carried, wore, and was given that day constituted a layered text. Her own family's heirloom lace, Queen Mary's veil, the royal collection's diamonds, and the symbolism of the ermine already working before the ceremony had even begun. The wedding cake had 8 tiers, described by contemporaries in extravagant detail. Following the wedding breakfast at Buckingham Palace, the couple honeymooned at Polesden Lacey, a manor house in Surrey owned by Mrs. Ronald Greville. Then they went to Scotland, where Elizabeth caught whooping cough. American journalists, visiting the display of gifts in the picture gallery at Buckingham Palace, arranged under Queen Mary's personal supervision, estimated the total value at approximately $1 million. That figure tells you what kind of wedding this actually was. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon had not been inevitable. She was born August 4, 1900, the ninth of 10 children of Claude George Bowes-Lyon, the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn. The family seat was Glamis Castle in Angus, Scotland, a Lyon family residence since 1372, a building of towers and turrets that sat in the Angus glens in the manner of something from a medieval chronicle. Her title at birth was the Honourable Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, a courtesy designation given to the daughter of an earl. Aristocratic, certainly. Royal? Not even close. The Bowes-Lyon family could trace descent from Robert the Bruce, which gave them romantic pedigree without proximity to the throne. In Britain's social order, the gap between the daughter of a Scottish earl and the wife of a king's son was substantial. Princes were expected to marry princesses, or had been historically. That Albert was free to choose a British aristocrat who wasn't a member of any royal family was itself described at the time as a gesture toward political modernization. The observation says something about how unusual the match was perceived to be. Elizabeth had been a known figure in aristocratic London before she ever encountered the royal family formally, described by contemporaries as charming, socially at ease, possessed of a laugh that was genuinely contagious, and an ability to make people feel immediately at home. She was admired not for any particular accomplishment, but for a quality that is harder to quantify than accomplishment. A warmth that registered as authentic rather than performed, which made it more valuable, not less. She had options beyond marriage. Reports from 1922 describe her receiving a significant offer connected to the American oil business, the same sector, incidentally, that her eventual husband's equerry, James Stuart, had gone into. Stuart had been courting Elizabeth himself. He left Albert's service for that better-paid position, and Albert, left without his equerry and reportedly fueled by the absence, became more determined. None of this is the narrative of a woman waiting to be rescued by a prince. Prince Albert, Duke of York, the second son of King George V, had first encountered Elizabeth at a London ball in 1920, an introduction made by Stuart himself. He became determined in the months that followed that he would marry her. His family saw the value in her, though Queen Mary declined to interfere directly with her son's courtship. What followed was unusual. Prince Albert proposed to Elizabeth at least 3 times before she agreed. The first proposal came in 1921, reportedly made through intermediaries. She refused. The reason she gave, preserved in her private letters, was direct. She was afraid never again to be free to think, speak, and act as I feel I really ought to. That isn't the language of someone overwhelmed by royal attention. It's the language of someone who understood exactly what she was being asked to surrender. Her opinions, her movements, her ability to live as she chose, rather than as the institution required. She said no. In February 1922, she served as a bridesmaid at the wedding of Princess Mary, Albert's sister, to Viscount Lascelles, the first time she had participated in a royal event in any formal capacity. The following month, Albert proposed again. She refused again. The pattern of refusals was, by this point, causing some quiet consternation among the people around Albert, though he himself remained committed. There was a third proposal in January 1923. She accepted, but reportedly not without a further 12-day delay in giving her final answer. Following the engagement, she agreed to speak to the press. A reporter described her as relaxed and laughing. She referred to Albert by his family nickname, Bertie. The king was furious in private, according to accounts from the period. Calling a prince by his family nickname to a journalist wasn't how royal engagement announcements were supposed to go. It was too informal, too familiar, too human. Which was, of course, precisely the quality that would make her indispensable. Queen Mary's response to the engagement announcement was immediate and elaborate. She wrote that the royal family was simply enchanted with Elizabeth. She invited the Earl and Countess of Strathmore to spend a weekend at the King's Sandringham estate in Norfolk, and she gave Elizabeth her first piece of royal jewelry, a sunburst diamond brooch pendant, presented immediately after the engagement was announced, weeks before the April wedding. The timing of that gift wasn't incidental. Queen Mary gave it the day the engagement became official, before any ceremony, before any public celebration. The signal it carried was unambiguous. The family had decided. Elizabeth belonged to this world now. In the weeks between the January acceptance and the April 26th wedding, a substantial quantity of objects moved from royal and aristocratic hands into Elizabeth's possession, not as a single transaction, but as a series of deliberate acts that, read together, constituted something closer to investiture than gift-giving. Begin with the ring itself. On January 16th, the Duke of York requested that sapphire rings be sent to Buckingham Palace for his inspection. The following day, Elizabeth was present as they examined the options together, mutually approved and selected, as contemporary records describe it. The chosen ring was too large for her finger. It was sent to Bird & Company at 3 Vigo Street in Mayfair for resizing, and collected by noon on January 19th. A cashmere sapphire flanked by 2 diamonds. A jeweler, quoted in the Exeter and Plymouth Gazette, declared he had never seen a more beautiful blue. Cashmere sapphires of that quality are among the rarest stones on earth, produced in a single mine in the Zanskar range of northern India, the deposits of which had become largely exhausted by the early 20th century. The ring was reportedly her favorite piece of all the jewels she ever owned. She wore it publicly until at least the mid-1940s, when she stopped appearing with it on her ring finger and switched to a pearl ring surrounded by diamonds. What happened to the cashmere sapphire engagement ring after that point is a genuine gap in the record. It simply stops appearing in photographs and documented accounts. Specialist sources describe its whereabouts as unknown. From Prince Albert himself came a series of wedding gifts: a pearl and diamond necklace designed with a Greek key pattern and 7 large V-shaped festoon drops, a substantial piece, formal and architectural in its construction. A large diamond cluster corsage brooch with a floral design and 3 dangling pendants, a diamond bar brooch with a central stone, multiple strings of pearls, a sapphire and diamond pendant given jointly with Queen Mary. The pearl and diamond necklace didn't remain a necklace. In the years after the wedding, it was taken apart and rebuilt, reworked into what became known as the lotus flower tiara. This transformation is documented and matters. An object given as a gift for the throat became a crown-like ornament for the head. The escalation in symbolic register wasn't accidental. At the 1937 coronation of George VI, Elizabeth loaned the lotus flower tiara to her elder sister, Lady Elphinstone, who wore it in Westminster Abbey. The piece that had started as Albert's wedding necklace, now circulating within the family as a tiara, its identity as Elizabeth's object persisting even as it sat on someone else's head. For the 8 bridesmaids, Albert commissioned 8 York rose brooches from Gerard, the royal jeweler. Each one was carved from frosted rock crystal in the shape of the White Rose of York, centered with diamond-set initials, E.A., for Elizabeth and Albert, surmounted by a coronet. 8 versions of the same object, carrying the couple's combined initials, distributed among the women who stood with Elizabeth on the day. Even the peripheral figures in the ceremony were given objects that bore the couple's mark. From Queen Mary came a suite of sapphire and diamond jewels, a fringe necklace, a large corsage brooch with 2 sapphire pendants, a bracelet, a ring, and several smaller brooches. The sapphire brooch from this suite appears most consistently in photographs of Elizabeth during the years immediately after the wedding. She pinned it to her hat during the 1920s, using it as a day accessory rather than reserving it for formal occasions, which meant it appeared in street-level photographs and newsreel footage rather than just state occasions. Specialist sources identify it as a piece she wore with particular regularity. The sapphire fringe earrings that appear in later portraits were reportedly reworked from the necklace in the same suite. Again, a transformation, the collection rebuilding itself around her changing needs. Queen Mary also passed along the teak flower brooch from her own personal collection. Whether it traveled directly from Mary to Elizabeth or via Albert as intermediary isn't entirely clear from the sources, but its origin was from Queen Mary's own jewelry and its transfer was deliberate. King George V gave what specialists describe as spectacular: the turquoise tiara and parure, a complete matched set comprising tiara, necklace, brooch, and earrings, all in turquoise and diamond. This would remain Elizabeth's grandest tiara for the next decade. A gift of that scale and specificity from a sitting king carried a meaning that nobody in 1923 needed to have explained. It was a statement of acceptance from the highest available authority in the land. His son had chosen her. The king endorsed it. Queen Alexandra, already in her late 70s in 1923 and dead by November 1925, gave Elizabeth a seed pearl and amethyst necklace with a heart-shaped amethyst clasp. Alexandra was the widow of King Edward VII and the mother of King George V, the oldest living woman in the royal family, the senior figure in a dynasty, and she chose a piece that was delicate rather than grand, feminine rather than formal. That necklace disappeared from the public record for nearly 90 years after Alexandra gave it. It was reportedly photographed on Queen Camilla in the 21st century. The arc of that single object, from the hands of a Victorian queen's daughter-in-law in 1923 to a public appearance after 2005, maps something essential about how royal objects move through time and households. From the City of London came a diamond and pearl sautoir necklace made by Carrington, 5 rows of pearls on platinum wire, diamond side pieces, and a large pearl drop. An institutional gift from a civic body, not a family member. The acknowledgement from London itself, from the city rather than the palace, that this woman had arrived at a new social position. Elizabeth wore it in October 1923 on the couple's trip to Belgrade, one of her first international appearances as the Duchess of York. And from her own father, the 14th Earl of Strathmore, came the Strathmore Rose Tiara, a garland of wild roses and diamonds, mounted in silver and gold, with 5 sapphires that could be substituted for diamonds at the center of each rose, making it a convertible piece. Elizabeth wore it for a portrait in the 1920s and at the opera in the 1930s. Then rarely again. The tiara from her non-royal family, the piece that connected her to the world she had occupied before 1923, was the one she wore least. Queen Mary personally supervised the arrangement of the wedding gifts in the picture gallery at Buckingham Palace. She decided what the public would see, in what order, to what effect. This wasn't hospitality, it was curation, a deliberate presentation of evidence that Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had been absorbed into the most powerful family in Britain, and that the absorption had been generous, enthusiastic, and complete. Elizabeth had turned down that family's proposal twice. She had hesitated for 12 days before giving her final answer. She had written in private about her fear of losing her freedom. And then, in the span of a few months in early 1923, she received diamonds, sapphires, turquoise, pearls, and Welsh gold from a king, a queen, a grandmother-in-law, and institutions across the country, and the whole collection was laid out in a palace gallery for assessment. The wedding rings themselves, both hers and Albert's, were made from 22-carat Welsh gold from the Clogau St. David's mine in Bontddu, in North Wales. The choice established a tradition. Every royal wedding ring since has been made from the same source. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon didn't just receive a tradition at her wedding, she started one. From April 26, 1923 forward, Elizabeth was the Duchess of York, and the objects she had received became tools of a kind that had no formal name. Her signature style coalesced around pearls almost immediately. She had received multiple strands from Albert, the diamond and pearl sautoir from the City of London, and a pearl and diamond bracelet from her mother. She wore them constantly and consistently. Portraits of the Duchess of York from the 1920s and 1930s almost invariably show multiple pearl strands at the throat, long ropes, layered strands, always present. Academic work on the Queen Mother's jewelry describes pearls as her signature jewel, a designation she earned by repetition rather than proclamation. The pearls she wore at state occasions were, more often than not, the same pearls she had received as wedding gifts. The signature wasn't invented. It was inherited, and then worn until it seemed innate. The turquoise tiara and parure from King George V tracks precisely through the major set pieces of her public career as Duchess and then Queen. She wore it at the 1929 wedding of Crown Prince Olav of Norway to Princess Martha of Sweden, an event attended by most of the crowned heads of Europe, a gathering at which appearance and precedence were observed with exceptional care. She wore it at a state visit to Belgium during the 1930s, at opera visits and official engagements through the mid-decade, at the French state visit in 1938, and on the 1939 tour of Canada and the United States, the most consequential public relations exercise the British monarchy undertook in the years immediately before the Second World War. A deliberate campaign to present King George VI and Queen Elizabeth as human, approachable, and democratically appealing to a North American public that might soon be asked to consider whether Britain's survival was worth caring about. She wore to that tour the tiara her father-in-law had given her at her wedding 16 years earlier. The piece that had marked her entry into the royal family appeared at the precise moment the royal family most needed to demonstrate its relevance beyond Britain's shores. The sapphire brooch from Queen Mary was pinned to her hat in the 1920s, used as a day piece, appearing in ordinary outdoor photographs rather than formal sittings, which meant it accumulated visual recognition across the ordinary texture of public life, rather than just its ceremonies. The same brooch that Mary had given as a formal wedding gift was being worn to go out in public, to be photographed in streets, in gardens, in the ordinary contexts where people saw the Duchess of York going about her life. The gift from the mother-in-law, appearing on the hat of a woman walking down a street, said something about belonging that no formal portrait could have managed. This is what systematic deployment of symbolic objects looks like when it isn't labeled as such. Not a jewel worn once at a ceremony and locked away. The same objects, rotating through public view across a decade and 2 decades, accumulating associations with the person wearing them, building visual recognition so steady and consistent that the audience eventually stopped noticing the objects and started noticing only the impression they produced. A woman who always appeared correctly, beautifully, unmistakably royal. A woman who seemed to have always been there. When the 1937 coronation came, George VI, having unexpectedly become king after his brother Edward VIII abdicated in December 1936, the crown made for Elizabeth as queen consort was constructed by Garrett using approximately 2,800 diamonds, the majority removed from other pieces already in the royal collection. It incorporated the Koh-i-Noor diamond, one of the most historically and symbolically loaded stones in the world, a gem whose ownership had moved through Mughal emperors, Persian conquerors, Afghan rulers, and Sikh Maharajas before arriving in British royal custody in 1849. She had entered the royal family as an aristocratic outsider, the daughter of a Scottish earl, a woman who had said no twice before saying yes. 14 years later, she was wearing the Koh-i-Noor on her head. The diamond flower earrings, documented as having been fashioned from a pearl and diamond necklace that was itself a wedding gift from her husband, became among her most frequently worn pieces from the 1940s onward. One specialist account records that they appeared from the 1940s until the very end of her life. That phrase covers 6 decades of consistent, photographed, documented wear. The earrings didn't change. Her face aged around them for 60 years. On February 6, 1952, King George VI died at Sandringham. He was 56 years old. Elizabeth was 51. She would be a widow for 50 years. The title she chose matters. A queen whose husband dies typically becomes the Dowager Queen, the word dowager serving to distinguish her from any subsequent queen consort. Elizabeth declined it. She styled herself Queen Elizabeth, a title that her daughter's coronation in June 1953 would require to be extended, for clarity, to Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. The rejection of dowager had practical consequences for how she was perceived and what public space she could continue to occupy. Dowager queens historically step back. They become ceremonial presences at family occasions. They don't headline tours, open hospitals, attend race meetings, or maintain their own households with the prominence of active royal participants. The title wasn't just semantic, it was structural, and she chose the structure that let her stay. She moved, eventually, to Clarence House. She took on the Castle of May in Caithness, a neglected Scottish pile she restored at her own expense. She maintained a public schedule that, even in her 80s and 90s, remained substantial. She raced horses, attended Cheltenham, was photographed at the Derby, appeared at Remembrance Day services in her own right, rather than as a supporting presence for the monarch. Through all of it, the jewelry continued. In 1951, 1 year before George VI's death, Elizabeth gave the turquoise tiara and parure, the most significant piece King George V had given her at her wedding, to Princess Margaret as a 21st birthday present. The object that had marked her own public appearances from a Norwegian royal wedding through the diplomatic tours of 2 continents was now on her daughter's head, and the Queen Mother was still alive, still making decisions, still managing what she wore and what she gave. In 1959, before Princess Margaret's wedding to Anthony Armstrong Jones, the Queen Mother gave her a tiara. The collection was being consciously redistributed, piece by piece, while she still had the authority to direct it. This wasn't the work of an executor. This was the work of someone who understood that jewelry in royal life isn't simply personal property. It's institutional currency, and you manage it accordingly. In November 1983, photographed at the Remembrance Day service at the Cenotaph, she wore the diamond bow brooch to secure her poppies in place. She was 83 years old. The cameras caught it. The brooch, fastened to the ribbons of a remembrance symbol at a national act of mourning, made exactly the kind of image that a woman of her experience and instincts understood would be made. A piece of diamond jewelry, caught in the November light on Whitehall, doing what the objects in her collection had always done, carrying meaning that the occasion required. The diamond flower earrings appeared in photographs from her 4th decade of widowhood, as readily as they had in her 40s. The pearl ring she had substituted for the cashmere sapphire in the late 1940s became so consistently photographed on her hand that it registered in public memory as simply her ring. The original sapphire, with its origins in that January morning at Vigo Street in Mayfair, having disappeared from view so long ago that most people who ever took her photograph had never seen it. The Strathmore Rose tiara, the one from her father, the piece that predated her royal life, the garland of diamond wild roses from a Scottish earl who died at Glamis in 1944, sat, by multiple accounts, in a vault for nearly 90 years. The piece that linked her to who she had been before the wedding was the one she put away first and kept away longest. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, died at Royal Lodge, Windsor, on March 30th, 2002. She was 101 years old, 50 years a widow, almost to the month. The administration of her estate began, and here, the public record becomes significantly thinner. British royal wills aren't open documents. The wills of the Queen Mother and several other senior royals were ordered sealed, meaning the specific distribution of her jewelry has never been officially confirmed. What is known comes from press reporting, specialist analysis of later royal appearances, and occasional references in authorized biographies, none of which constitute a definitive inventory of what went where. What the record can confirm is this: at least one piece from the Queen Mother's collection had already transferred to Queen Elizabeth II during her mother's lifetime. A flower brooch with a pearl center, documented in the Queen Mother's possession, had passed to her daughter by 1953, noted in specialist sources on the royal collection. The living collection was already in motion before she died. Princess Margaret had died in February 2002, just weeks before her mother. The turquoise parure that the Queen Mother had given Margaret in 1951 passed through Margaret's estate separately. The two women who had shaped the post-war royal family's public image died within weeks of each other, and pieces that had moved between them across decades were suddenly subject to the ordinary machinery of inheritance: sealed wills, legal administration, private distribution. One element of the record that bears addressing is the Greville collection, which frequently appears in discussions of the Queen Mother's jewelry and is sometimes conflated with her wedding-era pieces. Mrs. Ronald Greville, a society hostess of considerable wealth, left her extensive personal collection to the Queen Mother in 1942. Those are Greville pieces, separately acquired, separately associated. When Catherine, Princess of Wales, wore the Greville chandelier earrings at a diplomatic corps reception, she was wearing a piece from the Queen Mother's collection, but not one that originated in the 1923 gift exchange. The distinction is meaningful because the wedding gifts carry a specific argument about investiture and identity that accumulated acquisitions don't. Different objects, different weight. Where the 1923 pieces themselves went is harder to trace with precision, and that opacity isn't accidental. Royal jewelry inheritance isn't transparent by design. The Crown has no obligation to publish what passed from a Queen Mother's personal collection to her heirs. What arrived at which vault, under whose custodianship, in what form? The public record simply does not contain that information in reliable detail. What the public record does contain is a series of later appearances, documented with varying degrees of certainty by analysts who track royal jewelry over time. Sapphire jewels from the Queen Mother's collection have been reported as worn by Catherine, Princess of Wales, though attribution at the individual piece level traces to analytical video rather than court-level documentation and should be treated as reported rather than confirmed. The Strathmore Rose Tiara is a different case, and a more resonant one. Multiple specialist sources describe Catherine wearing it. The tiara from Elizabeth's father, the piece that spent nearly 90 years reportedly untouched in a vault. Elizabeth herself wore it for a portrait in the 1920s, at the opera in the 1930s, and then set it aside. If the attribution is accurate, a diamond garland commissioned to celebrate an aristocratic girl's marriage into the royal family traveled through the vault of the woman who became the Queen Mother, waited there across 6 decades of widowhood, and was retrieved to appear on the throat and wrists of a new generation. The diamond and pearl leaf brooch, attributed in specialist sources to the Queen Mother's collection, was worn by the Princess of Wales during royal mourning in September 2022, following the death of Queen Elizabeth II. A brooch at a royal funeral, securing the mourning silhouette, doing what objects from this collection have always done, marking a threshold. The court jeweler, the most authoritative non-official analyst of royal jewelry, has written that Catherine has demonstrated through consistent choices that the Queen Mother is one of her personal royal role models for jewelry. That framing is instructive precisely because it frames the wearing of these pieces as deliberate rather than incidental. Catherine has access to an enormous range of royal jewelry. The choice to reach specifically for pieces associated with the Queen Mother, particularly at moments of high visibility and historical weight, suggests an understanding of what those pieces carry. Objects accumulate meaning from the people who wore them before. You wear the piece, and you wear its history. The machinery that began in April 1923 was never hidden. It was visible at the time to anyone paying attention. The wedding was filmed from 19 camera positions. The dress had been previewed to the press and sketched in the papers before the ceremony took place. The gifts were displayed in a palace gallery, their value estimated and published internationally. Queen Mary supervised the arrangement of that display herself. What made Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's image so durable wasn't that the mechanism was concealed. It was that the mechanism worked so well that the result, a warm, charming, approachable woman who seemed to belong to the monarchy by temperament rather than by acquisition, felt more authentic than the process that produced it. She had refused twice before she agreed. She had spent 12 days deliberating before giving her final answer. She had written, in language she evidently meant, about her fear of losing the freedom to be herself. None of that was incompatible with what followed. She chose the role, fully and apparently without reservation once the decision was made, and then performed it with extraordinary consistency across 8 decades. The jewels were part of the performance, not costume jewelry, but documents, each piece carrying a specific relationship, a specific signal about where she stood in the family she had married into, and what that family thought of her. The cashmere sapphire from the groom said, he chose this specifically, together with her, at a specific address in Mayfair. The sunburst brooch from Queen Mary said, the family accepted her before the wedding had even happened. The turquoise parure from King George V said, the king himself endorsed this woman. The Strathmore rose tiara from her father said, she was someone before she was any of this. She wore the royal gifts constantly across her public life and wore the family piece rarely. And the message accumulated over decades into the image everyone now recognizes. The beaming matriarch, the national grandmother, the woman who was never, somehow, not royal. The Welsh gold rings she and Albert wore in April 1923 established a tradition that extended through every subsequent royal wedding for a century. The pearl necklace Albert gave her became a tiara worn at the Coronation and loaned to her sister. The turquoise parure passed to Princess Margaret. The seed pearl and amethyst necklace from Queen Alexandra disappeared and reappeared nearly 90 years later. The Strathmore rose tiara waited in a vault and was retrieved. The diamond flower earrings were worn from the 1940s until the final years of a life that ended in 2002. The cashmere sapphire engagement ring, the stone she had chosen herself at Vigo Street, the blue that a jeweler said he had never seen bettered, vanished from the record in the late 1940s and hasn't been publicly accounted for since. It's the one piece from the beginning of all this that simply can't be traced, which means it remains somewhere in the form it was given, or in some other form, or lost. The archive is incomplete. Royal wills are sealed. The collection does not give up all its information. What remains is the image, and the objects that still surface on the wrists and throats of women who weren't yet born when Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon paused at the tomb of the unknown warrior and set down her bouquet. Those women choose to wear these pieces at specific moments, at mourning ceremonies, at diplomatic receptions, at occasions where the visual language of royal continuity needs to be spoken clearly. They reach for pieces that carry 80 years of associations. a Scottish aristocrat's daughter who became a queen consort, a widow who refused the title of dowager, a woman who understood from the first day that the objects you wear are part of what you say. The Queen Mother's wedding treasures looked like tokens of love, but they also became the first pieces of armor in the image she wore for the next 80 years. If you're interested in more stories like this, the objects behind the personas, the machinery beneath the myth, subscribe and we'll keep bringing them to you.